Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this legal compliance session run by Kaizen Synery law firm. My name is Nihal, Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synery law firm, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. While we are based in Victoria, this session is being covers the full scope of all states and territories around Australia. I can see that a few people have got their hand raised as well too, and we will come to those. If you do have any questions, by all means use the questions bar around this as well too, and we will come to you throughout today's session. With this session is being recorded all the way up to the question and answer part of the webinar, where we will open up the phone lines, and more than happy to stay on the line and answer questions that you might have around what we've spoken about today. As I've mentioned, we are covering the full state and territory requirements all around Australia. Today's session really focuses on the workplace obligations. As a law firm, we do get questions around everything from the COVID vaccines to what requirements agencies need to meet, specifically also on compliance registers, the full scope of it. So what we have sought to do is really run a series of 4 sessions. This is the second part of it, focusing on key topics that your agency needs to be aware of in order to meet its COVIDSafe compliance obligations. There are a range of resources that we will also send out to you straight after today's webinar as well too. You can start using those immediately. I also note that I am joined today by Lynette and Ruby from our support desk. They will also reach out to you directly after today's webinar, just to make sure that you can log into the Gemba 360 dashboard and you can access the relevant resources that are available to you to use as well too, as reference for your agency as well. So that said, let's move across this. We are looking at workplace obligations, and I will come to what those specific requirements are. First of all, as always, we do pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So today's webinar really focuses on 5 specific areas. Essentially, what we are seeing around the country is rolling lockdowns being used across different states, and agencies, particularly in the not-for-profit community service space, whether you're from aged care space, providing disability services, whether you're providing migrant resource services, whether you're an education provider, for example, schools, there are some really, I'm going to say, basic core tools that you should be using. And also there are some key legal requirements that you also should be aware of. Specifically, I'm going to say to ensure, first of all, that your staff, volunteers, and services, whether that be to clients, or to for schools, whether it be to students and the likes, whether you're a migrant resource centre providing services to refugees and the likes. Essentially, there are some broad areas that you need to be aware of in terms of where your work health and safety obligations sit. Essentially, how we've divided these is to look at vaccination and what your WHS duties are, answering the questions of, do I have to make sure my workers are vaccinated under work health and safety laws? Do I need to include mandatory vaccination as a control measure to comply with WHS duties? And what legal systems do you need to have in place, as opposed to also the HR registers and workplace COVIDSafe forms as well. So we're going to look at those and look at piecing these together for you as well too. That said, leading into next week as well, we are going to be looking at updating of the COVIDSafe plans as well, and also essentially taking apart the office space that yourselves may find yourselves working in, and looking at, well, what are the specific items that I should be having in place as lockdown rules are changed and moved and flexed and whatever else you want to say around them. What essentially do you need to look at from a risk management point of view, whether it be a home-based office or a workplace? Essentially, we're going to take apart the office building and look at all the new rules that we know are moving through Parliament, as we can see today. So essentially, if I can put this into context around work health and safety, one of the things that we have found, and we've been running these webinars since February last year, is around essentially the Commonwealth Government's COVID vaccination policy, and looking at what the rollouts of these will be. We've seen, obviously, and this is going back, I'm going to say, several months ago, where there was the article in the paper around this from one of the medical associations that essentially said that lockdowns are to be a part of the Australian way of life, essentially until people are vaccinated. And this was something that came out of the medical associations groups. And we pointed that out going back several months ago, that essentially this is something that agencies are going to need to do. Now, essentially by attending this webinar, what we said this since February last year, we have onboarded some 4,000 agencies into using the Gemba 360 dashboard. It is something that yourselves have access to, essentially use. But really what you need to look at and we hope that you get from these webinars, is a better understanding of the specific COVID rules. And we're going to be looking at the workplace audits and vaccination registers that you need to be across, improve your awareness of HR rules and what and how these work, and also look at getting a timely collection of resources that your agencies can essentially use from today. We will also be looking at what case examples of what other agencies have done, and really give you an idea and a sense of what they've been doing to put some of these practices that I'm going to talk about today into practice, to show you how they've effectively managed what legal obligations we're talking of today. So with it, as I've mentioned, this session is being recorded all the way up to the Q&A part of today's session, where we will at that stage switch off the recording. We do encourage you to ask questions as we go through today's session. We will get to all of the questions before the end of the webinar as well too. If you do have any questions around this, as I said, we will send these through as a circular to all attendees. If you did also want to have a look at the other materials of what we've done, we do have this accessible on our website, and it is also available on our YouTube channel as well too. And you can see we've even got last week's webinar as well too. The access to the Gemba 360 dashboard will also be circulated out to you as well too, and you will get access to these resources, which includes also all of the forms that I'm talking about today as well. So that said, let's move across around the registers, which I'll show you. We'll walk these through. Just a couple of information, because we do have a few new agencies again joining us today. Kaizen Synergy Law Firm has been running these public webinars around Colbert legal compliance really since February last year. You can view these on our YouTube channel, as I've mentioned. As part of that, the legal compliance system is being used by over 6,500 agencies around the country at last count around that. And that was a number of years ago before we onboarded a number of these agencies. The Gemba 360 platform is a legal compliance system. It has a range of COVIDSafe modules and risk registers, HR registers, document registers that you can also use across it. One of the big things that we've seen from the take-ups of COVID is that it is mobile friendly as well too. So if people need to access it not only from their desktops, but also from mobiles, be that iPads, iPhones, mobile devices. Essentially, you can access it from anywhere you like as well too. So that said, let's move on to today's webinar. What we are focusing around is your work health and safety obligations. Information that you need to know about is really around vaccination and my work health and safety duties, answering questions, do I have to make sure my workers are vaccinated under WHS laws? Do you need to include mandatory vaccinations as a control measure to comply with work health and safety duties? And what are some of the legal systems that your agency needs to consider? So let's have a look at what the new rules are. Essentially, from a workplace point of view, what agencies are really looking for is clarity on your workplace rights and obligations as vaccines become available in Australia. Now, there are currently no laws or public health orders specifically that do require employers to be vaccinated. And you can see I've just needed to update this slide because currently there is the focus on aged care, residential aged care, being made by National Cabinet. So while the government's policy is that vaccination is voluntary, what they have started to do is to focus on specific groups and groups and specific parts of the sector where people are at high risk. So what does that mean for yourselves? And we can see that we've got a large number of aged care agencies. We've also got disability services that are joining us. We've also got specifically health service agencies and elective surgery agencies joining us, as well as other outreach services like migrant resource centres and schools as well too. So what does this mean for yourselves around this? Well, essentially, the Australian government has focused on vaccination as part of its criteria to say, well, we will look at lifting lockdown measures. But until that process comes up, essentially rolling lockdown measures, and we're seeing that to some degree, the differences in approach between Victoria, between New South Wales that have been taken over the past number of weeks, as well as essentially fines being issued for non-compliance around mandating around the various lockdown requirements. So on the 28th of June, National Cabinet agreed that COVID vaccinations are to be mandated for residential aged care workers as a condition of working in an aged care facility through shared state, territory and Commonwealth authorities, and also ensuring compliance measures are in place. Now, in different states, for example, in New South Wales, we're seeing that they've extended that to include quarantine workers, people working in distributions as well too. We've seen that in and logistics. We've seen in Queensland they've taken a different approach whereby they're focused on healthcare workers as well. Victoria has what we call daily attestation forms for people that are providing services into aged care and health services as well. And South Australia has taken a different approach again around the lack of mandating specific sectors. So there is this mix in what is being required. However, where does that then leave yourselves in relation to ensuring that your workers are vaccinated under work health and safety laws? Now, under work health and safety, you as specific positions in your agency, whether you be a manager, whether you be in charge of HR or you're a CEO or the likes, or the risk manager, you essentially are a officer of your company. And you're required to ensure that people meet their work health and safety obligations. And I can just see the questions start to light up by what do we mean by officer of a company around that, and I'll come to that in a minute. So essentially, under work health and safety, you have a duty to eliminate, or if not possible, minimise so far as reasonably practical the risk of exposure to COVID-19 in the workplace. Now, you may not be able to completely eliminate the risk of workers being exposed to COVID-19 while carrying out work. However, you must do all that is reasonably practicable to minimise this risk. And one of the ways to do this is to ensure that you do that by looking at the different control measures issued by WorkSafe around this. Now, Fair Work have been quite clear to say that it is unlikely that a requirement for workers to be vaccinated will be reasonably practicable in most agencies. Now, as part of being what we mean by a director under work health and safety obligations, there is the definition of directors and officers of companies, people that are in relevantly controlled positions. So when we look at directors, that often will include simply the board members of your agency to ensure that workers abide by work health and safety obligations. When we look at officers of a company, which is the other part of it, it does cover off work health and safety requirements, and those people are what we've seen in operational positions. So that includes CEOs, that certainly includes compliance and risk managers, that certainly includes managers that look after or have the portfolio of WHS or compliance to ensure that risks are essentially minimised. So it is important that in your roles that you do be aware of what these risks are. We will and we are aware that WorkSafe have also been undertaking risk audits as well too. And for that reason, one of the tools that you do have access to, and I will just jump into your Gemba dashboard, is what we call the Colbert Risk Assessment Matrix. And with that, if you click on this button here, what you will see is essentially a Colbert risk assessment. And you'll see the little chat buttons, which I will just mention to you now as well too. If you do have questions and you are going through this, this will connect you directly to our support desk. So if you do have questions around this as well too, and you need some assistance either later today in actually completing this, then you can simply click on this and start the chat directly with the support desk as well too. And they will be able to help you directly on this. Now, this form came directly from Safe Work and also Fair Work in terms of what they're looking at. So a question is, do you have workplace facilities for hand washing or hand sanitizing? It is a question, are these sufficiently stocked and in good working? So we have put yes or no questions in order for you to complete these. These are really a short form. It gives you the core information of what you need to do within your agency and almost treat it like a quick health check of whether you're meeting your requirements. But I will come back to this as well too of how that actually works. So essentially, when you look at vaccinations as part of your work health and safety, it is essential that you understand that mandatory, when we ask the questions, do I need to include mandatory vaccinations as a control measure to comply with my work health and safety duties? Now, even Fair Work have quite openly said it is unlikely that a requirement to be vaccinated will be reasonably practicable for most agencies. However, this is because at present public health experts such as the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee has not recommended a vaccine be mandatory in specific industries as yet. And there may not be a vaccine available to your workers as well too. And we're seeing that currently now. And also some of your workers may have medical reasons why they cannot be vaccinated as well too. However, ultimately, whether you should require your workers to be vaccinated will depend on the particular circumstance at the time you're undertaking your risk assessment too. So Fair Work, when we've taken this information from Fair Work and looked at this, they're kind of sitting with a foot in both camps. So on one hand, they're saying, look, it may not be reasonably practical, but when you do your risk assessment, you may want to consider whether it is or not. And essentially what they've given us is this checklist tool here. And we will, and I can see a few people asking, will we get access to these slides? yes, absolutely, after today's session, we will be sending this out to all of you to look at and you can use as well. So some factors you should consider on an ongoing basis is essentially what is the AHPPC recommending for vaccinations within your industry? Will workers be exposed to risk of infections as part of their work? For example, hotel quarantine will be at higher risk of exposure when their work duties place them in contact with people who may be affected. We're also seeing this obviously in aged care. We're seeing this in vulnerable groups such as Aboriginal and community health agencies. We're seeing this in NDIS-funded agencies as well. And we're also seeing this in schools. And schools are one of the groups that we are doing a lot of work in as well too, because we're seeing a real shift in community expectation around this, where we're now seeing, especially with the new Delta variant, we are seeing people and children actually having symptoms of COVID-19, and we're seeing this readily on the news as well too. We are seeing that there is a social shift now for teachers to be vaccinated and the push around this as well. And I will come to how some agencies are specifically dealing with this issue at the moment. Now, the next question that the Fair Work have said is, do workers work with people who would be vulnerable? So, for example, what I've just said around that with NDIS or people with an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background, what is the likelihood that they could spread COVID-19 in the workplace? A school's a really good example at the moment. We are seeing that in Victoria. We're seeing that in New South Wales as well too, where the transmissions within the schools are certainly now being headlined across the news in the past few weeks. The other question is, do your workers interact with large numbers of people in the course of their work that could contribute to a super spreading event if your workers contract COVID-19? And so we're starting to see that again in settings like community events as well. And what other control measures are available in your workplace? So essentially, what we are seeing is a checklist of assessment of running this down. We have included this in the form, and you've got these in your materials to also use. Now, essentially, when we look at case studies of agencies that have implemented these systems in place since February last year, what we are seeing in two agencies, Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative, and we thank Laurie Seville, the Chief Operating Officer out there, and also Women's Housing Limited with Judy Lyon, the Chief Executive Officer, and Lena Tompkinson, who has implemented the systems right across it. I do also acknowledge agencies like Migrant Resource Centres as well too, and Patricia Matthews, who has joined us again today as well too, has been responsible in actually coordinating the push out at the Southern Migrant Resource Centre around daily attestation forms, which we will come to as well too. And here it is here. So essentially what agencies have done as well is to look at using a daily attestation form. This is the one that is being used in Victoria at the moment and mandated by the Victorian government in particular sectors. And essentially what they've done is to ask a series of questions, and I'll bring this up here, around a series of questions in the Gemba dashboard that says, right, how do we know that our workers are actually free from COVID-19 symptoms? So before we're looking at QR codes from a work health and safety point of view, what is the screening process that we have in place? Now, we know that we can't mandate some for people to have the vaccine. However, before we do that, what is the process to ensure that people are kept safe around this as well? And when you log into your Gemba dashboard, what you'll find is the COVID-19 daily assessment form. And this assessment form is an attestation form. It allows you to ask the series of questions. And we stress this is also being used in New South Wales as well too. And with that, what we are seeing is that they are able to essentially use this to screen people to assess whether they are actually meeting their safety obligations and whether people are actually free from any symptoms of COVID-19. And with it, depending on where you are based, you will see that these different outbreak locations will be also updated. And essentially what we found is that agencies are also using this form to also verify volunteers and essentially give them a specific check and balance on whether their workforce, whether they be staff, volunteers, parents groups, are free from any COVID symptoms before they've actually had any other work health and safety checks that have been done. We've then seen them update their relevant policy documents as well too. And in your dashboard, you do also have access to a series of COVID-19 policy documents. And if we search for these as well too, what you'll find is, and I'll just bring this up, the COVID-19 folder, and what will come up is a series of policies that you can also have access to as well too. Now, with it, as we move through this as well too, what we've found, and I'll just mention this to how agencies have implemented this of what I'm talking about, is all of these forms from a work health and safety point of view, whether it be your daily assessment forms, your cleaning register forms, your staff checks, essentially they can access this via their mobile device. And this is important for agencies when we look at New South Wales, for example, where they have lockdown specific regions, and essentially people can't travel in or out of the area unless they've essentially undertaken a COVID test in some circumstances. Now, essentially the form that I'm talking about here allows you to access this via mobile. We're also seeing schools implement this as well too. And I do shout out to Trish Matthews as well too, and again from the Southern Migrant Resource Centre, where a number of their staff actually use their mobile device before they actually log into work to essentially complete this COVID daily assessment form. And it is working incredibly well. We know that because a number of staff actually contacted us yesterday through the support desk to ask a couple of questions around this. And essentially what they've been able to do is to have staff or volunteers essentially complete their COVID form. It's then marked that it's been done and they've met their work health and safety obligations as well as fair work obligations as well. And essentially we're seeing the same thing being done by Women's Housing Limited as well. So when you look into your work health and safety obligations around this, what you can have access to, you will get your login details, which will your username. You can go to gemba360.com, which is the legal compliance system that we run. You will get your username if you haven't accessed this already, which is your email address and your set password. Once you log in, and Lynette, and I can see a few questions coming up, Lynette and Ruby will give you a call straight after today's session to make sure that you can log in to this. Once you do that, you will see that your COVID-19 form is available for you to use for your staff and volunteers, and this gives you the checks to be able to do this across your agency group. The other part of the system that you will have is access to your COVID-19 risk assessment form. And this gives you your safe work audit checks, and essentially you should be able to provide answers to each of these questions. And by doing that, that gives you a specific tool to ensure that you're meeting your COVID COVIDSafe obligations for your agency. And there are a whole series of questions. If you do have any questions while completing that form, you'll see that we've got the chat button that is available to you, and you can simply contact us even that way to get support, and we can share screens to help you do that as well. The other part of the system that you do have access to directly around this, especially for disability and aged care agencies as well and schools, is the HR site. And the HR site essentially will give you, and it'll just reload for us here, what this will give you access to is the ability to run your vaccination registers and information across this as well too. And so you've got your complete set of tools right at your fingertips to be able to use this information and to use this toolbox around it. Essentially, those are the main parts that we wanted to cover off today. Now, a series of recommendations that we're going to make for you to make sure that you meet your work health and COVIDSafe work health and safety obligations is to review your COVIDSafe policies based on the information that we've included in this webinar. Look at running your workplace and audit checklist tool that I've shown you, your HR registers as well. And if you have any questions, you can contact us directly on the mobile or directly to our 1300 360 360 number as well too. Just a reminder for next week, what we are covering off is your updated COVIDSafe plan as different lockdown measures change. And also we are going to walk through the risk assessment registers for your specific workplace as well too. And we're going to run through the risk reporting around this across your agency and what tools you need to have in place and what checklists you need to use as well too across this. If you do have any questions, we are about to open up the phone lines and also questions, and we're happy to stay online and answer any questions that you have as well too. You can also use the chat box as well too. If you are listening to this webinar via our recording and on our YouTube channel, by all means, please contact us on 1300 360 360 or email us at support@gemba360.com, and you can get access to the Gemba 360 compliance dashboard. Thank you for joining us today if you are listening to this via the recording, and we will open up the phone lines now to answer any questions that people might have.